On this episode, roles for husbands and wives. Completed! Howdy y'all. I'm Pastor Mark. I'm the pastor of Copeland Christian Church, and this is Theological Moments with Pastor Mark. It's good to be back with you all today. Today we're going to complete our series on the roles for Christian husbands and wives, as we've been looking at Ephesians 5, 21 to 33. I want to start with a quick review. Remember that we started in verse 21 talking about mutual submission. We talked about how this is the concept which undergirds our whole discussion of marriage. And when, as Christians, we are properly putting ourselves in the position of mutual submission, we are each looking after each other's needs so everybody's taken care of. This should be done with an attitude of joy, of gladness, not of one of begrudgment or bitterness or obstinance. This is especially important for wives who are commanded to submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, then, are commanded to love their wives. And this is a self-sacrificial type of love. It's the type of love which lays down its life for the other. But perhaps more importantly, it's the type of love that puts the other first all the time. And so husbands are to care for their wives as a part of his body, just as Christ cares for the church, his body. And this leads us to the great mystery that Paul reveals, that Christ in the church is not only the archetype or the example for how a marriage should look, but the inverse is also true, that a Christian marriage ought to be an illustration of Christ in the church, so that non-believing onlookers can be pointed to the gospel, can be pointed to the way Christ loves the church. This brings us to the final verse for our consideration today, verse 33, which reads, "However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband." The first verse is really just a restatement of what Paul has already talked about very clearly. And the second is actually also just a summative restatement, but it's a little veiled, right? Paul switches words and he changes from submit to what is translated as respect. And I think that's where we start looking at this. Is the Greek word there is the same word that's used in verse 21, reverence of Christ. The Greek word actually means fear. And modernly, we don't like that idea of a wife fearing her husband, probably the same way we don't like the idea of fearing God. And yet, we don't fear Christ because we're afraid that he's going to harm us, right? We fear Christ, i.e. we reverence Christ because we want to honor him, because we want to hold him in the highest esteem, right? Because we rightly and willingly obey him and submit to his leadership and authority. And so too, then, we see wives here are just again called to regard their husbands the way the church regards Christ, that is, to reverence him, to be in submission to him, which is what Paul said in verse 24. Wives, submit to your husbands as the church does to Christ. So let me share two final thoughts with y'all. First, the difficult fact is that there are no qualifiers to any of these. It's not conditional. Husbands must love their wives, whether they are submitting or not. Wives must submit to their husbands, whether they're loving them properly or not. Second, these roles are not given as a burden to be dutifully and begrudgingly carried out, but rather they are God's design for marriage and therefore a blessing. We will all necessarily fail at carrying out these roles, and our spouses will too. And yet, it's the mark of a mature Christian who, having failed, goes to their spouse and apologizes. Further, it is the mark of the mature Christian to accept that apology, leave it at that, and move on. Okay, that's it for this series. If you found these videos helpful, please click the like button and share them with a friend. If you have a comment for me, go ahead and leave that below. If you haven't subscribed, please do so and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.